All right, so welcome everybody. Wow, what an unbelievable crowd for a Tuesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I guess that really means that you are all super excited about food days and what food means to us personally. In the spirit of entrepreneurial thought and action at Babson, everything starts with desire. And so this is going to be a really special kind of a panel session. It's going to be an opportunity for these incredible thought leaders and pioneers in the food space to tell you their personal stories, to talk about why food is important to them, why they're in this work, and their greatest hope for the future of food. And the reason we're designing it this way is because my theory of change is that with starting with the heart and the stomach, it's a lot easier to find one's way and how they want to make a difference in food. So the first part of this session will be each of these amazing pioneers sharing a story with you of why they're in this space, and then they will be joining your tables for discussion around what they've shared and what their work is, and any questions you have. We really endeavor for the next 2 days to make conversation about food actionable, bite-sized, and relevant. So without further ado, because of sound reasons, I'm going to ask you to speak into this. And pass the mic. So I think we'll start with Katherine.
So you're a timekeeper as well, so thank you so much. Katherine DAmato, Greater Boston Food Bank. The Greater Boston Food Bank serves 190 cities and towns in 9 counties of eastern Massachusetts. We handle food from manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, all the way from farmers and growers through the system. Serve about 90,000 people a week. And to put it in perspective, 1 in 9 residents of Massachusetts needs our services. 1 in 8 is utilizing our services nationally. 1 in 7 Americans is food insecure, and 1 in 6 Americans is in poverty. So if you kind of frame our work and maybe our conversations around those 9, 8, 7, 6, if you remember nothing else, at least from my words. How'd I get here? I grew up in an immigrant Italian family. My grandparents were farmers. To own land in America was a very big deal. And they couldn't speak English. They couldn't write it, but they owned a piece of land and farmed it. From there, I grew up in a working class family. My father was a teamster for Blue Seal Bread. And when I was 8 years old, he opened a restaurant. And from there, I learned that if you were a nun or a priest coming through the front door, you got a free meal. And if you were a beggar asking to work in exchange for food through the back door, you got a free meal. So as an 8-year-old, I tried to put these together. What do these two things have in common? That these two populations of people get free food. And that lesson stayed with me for a very long time. My undergraduate's in theology, went back and did a degree in business. And so the issue of social justice became very important to me. And food is a social justice issue for me. To just bring through what do I want sort of for the world, hunger is not about food. There's an ample amount of food in the world. Maybe it's not in the right places, or in the right ways, or in the production of it might not be correct, or its utilization, or its location. But there is ample food, and better in this time. My grandfather taught us to use every bit of the pig but the squeal. All the way through now, I have a 26-year-old that grows his own food and is a part of growing food in Boston area. So it's like 3 generations later it lives on. But for me, the wish is that people can walk through the front door of any retailer and buy their own food and feed their families in whatever way they so choose. So my journey was clearly set by generations before me, and as a third generation food distributor, it's very clear to me about the impact of providing access to food, and more importantly, in this time that you all are a part of, healthy choices, safe choices, thinking about biodynamic farming practices, and being able to give the person that's in poverty equal access and the right to the same resource that you and I all have to be able to walk through the front door. So that's my wish, to be able to walk through the front door and to be able to get the food that you need for your family.
Thank you very much. Hard act to follow.
You can do it.
I'm not sure. You almost had me crying there at the beginning too. I at one point in my life, I was a homeless alcoholic and drug addict living on the streets of New York. Well, I wasn't actually living on the street. We had squatted a building in Lower Manhattan, and I actually the only meals that I got were in places where I could get a handout, and it's become a more well-known fact about my own personal history, but it's a very important thing that drives me to do what I do, because once you've been there, and I've been on both sides of that. I was a spoiled little rich jerk growing up in New York City. Your children are here, so I'm watching my language. You're welcome. And the whole world revolved around me. Everything was about me, 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 me. At the same time, I got to travel. I got to see the world. I got exposed to a great series of ideas through a great education and loving parents. And I saw that there was an amazing world out there, and it could be best understood through food. I just didn't know it at the time. I went to college, and I took Art History 101 at Vassar College. Day one of my freshman year, Madame Koretsky, the head of the Northern Renaissance painting department, got up, and she put a slide on the wall of a woman in a turban, a bowl of fruit on the ground, and a window, and in the window you could see the ocean, and there were some boats. And she said, write down everything that you see in that picture. And everyone wrote down the same 10 things. And then she started her talk, and she said, I'm sure you all noticed and she ticked them off, and everyone's like, yeah, we get an A, right? And she said, but here's what I see when I look at those 10 things. And she basically described 16th century Florentine life just through the information. She was like Sherlock Holmes. It never occurred to me that bananas didn't grow in Holland, right? I knew intellectually bananas didn't grow in Holland, but the idea that there were bananas on the table meant something about that family, who they were, what their business was, what the status was of Holland as a nation state. And I began to realize over the course of my food life, I got into restaurants, I started cooking at very high level with very famous people in big cities all around the world, Hong Kong, Paris, Venice, worked for 2 years for Thomas Keller in New York City. And I began to realize that it was stories about food, and it was the power of telling a tale could put it in perspective for people in a way that nothing else could. Flash forward to a point in my life where, by anyone's standards, in my genre, I'm very successful. 7 years, on television gives you a big platform. I happen to believe for those whom have been given so much, much is expected. And having had the life that I had, good and less fortunate, I learned more from my less fortunate circumstances, by the way. The idea that here in the greatest nation in the history, greatest culture in the history of the world, we have a food life that has never been so great for so few and never so horrible for so many. 9876. What we're doing here over the next couple of days is of the utmost importance. So I look forward to sharing more with you on all of that, and I will hand the microphone to my friend, Fred.
I am a professor of history and food waste here at Babson College, and when Rachel asked to be on the panel and explain what my food story is, I really had to do a lot of reflecting, and I'm a person that spends a lot of time listening to the radio when I'm in the car or listening to downloads. But yesterday was basically a day where I shut everything down so I could do some reflecting and think about what I would share with you all here. And I think the best way to explain how I ended up focusing on food really has to do a lot with my own athletic career. I played lacrosse at Syracuse University, and at that time, when I transferred to Syracuse from a junior college, I wasn't doing as well as I thought I would. And at that time, what many students, and I have some of my students that are in the room here, don't know is my first degree is in physical education. And that's what I did. I was certified K through 12 and was studying physical education. So I was taking anatomy, physiology, nutrition, all those different courses at Syracuse as an undergrad. And I began to hone in particularly on the nutrition aspect as a way of improving my athletic performance. So it was around the mid-'80s that I really began to change my diet for the purpose of increasing my athletic performance. Fast forward a couple years to 1988, and I was gearing up for trials for the U.S. national team, which was held in 1989, that summer. And again, I began to change things drastically, eliminate junk food from my diet, anything I could do to increase my performance, and actually became a vegan and maintained a vegan diet up until last fall. So this is a very long time where I hadn't eaten meat, Coca-Cola, any kind of soft drinks, just had not been part of my life for a very long time. Then so that happened, and I saw an improvement on my performance, and I just continued that vegan and very holistic lifestyle. And then I got to 2000, where I had finished my PhD in history, and I was working in metropolitan Washington, D.C., and there was a doctor putting on a seminar for a church. It was predominantly African-American church, and it was for men. And it was in February, and I really, because of my own lifestyle and history with food, I wanted to get involved. So I just approached him. I said, I really like to get involved. He looked at me and said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I'm an historian. I said, I know you have medical doctors going to be talking. Why don't I do a history of African-American foodways called The Origin of Soul Food? He said, wow, it'd be a great idea. Explain to people essentially the answer to the question, why we eat what we eat. And that really has evolved into a lot of what I do, which is I write and lecture about food traditions and try to explain to people, why do you do what you do? So I watched, my own family, older members of my family, both sides of my families, grandmothers born in the South. So I have very much a sense of Southern foodways. And when I finished that lecture, the reception was great, but one of the things I found out was that there was not very much published from an historian's point of view, archival documentation on why African Americans eat what they eat. So that was the first project that I did, was write a book on that. And then in the process of actually going out and doing a book tour, I quickly found out that a lot of the things that I thought were African American foodways, I found were rural foodways. And that people of all ethnicities across the United States and around the world were eating some of the same things. That is, when you're poor, you cannot afford to throw away anything. And a lot of what I learned about food waste comes from that perspective, not from white tablecloth food, but what people eat to survive. And that's a lot of what my research is about. Those traditions now, they change over a period of time.
Hey everybody, I'm David Waters. I'm the CEO at Community Servings, and I'm particularly excited to be here because many people in my position or our positions might be a social worker or a community activist, community organizer, but I think of myself as an entrepreneur. I was in the for-profit restaurant business before I was drawn to Community Servings. Community Servings, if you're not familiar with us, is a home-delivered meals program for people who are critically ill and can't feed themselves. We come to your home every week and bring you medically tailored meals for you and everyone else in your home while you're too sick from cancer, HIV, kidney failure, etc. I'll tell you a little more about that in a second. But the way that I was drawn to her was I was a kid who was always stealing the hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen. And my mother said, well, at least pass them first. And that was what drew me into the restaurant business. And I started as a dishwasher at 15, was managing the same restaurant at 19, and all the way through liberal arts school, supported myself in the food business. But I was also coming out of college. You're all too young to remember, but I was coming out of college in about 1981 at the dramatic height of the AIDS epidemic. And as a young gay guy, I was terrified because the message of HIV in the early years was love and affection equals death. And my best friend had a circle of 10 people, and we're talking your age, in your early to mid 20s, and in 5 years, 8 out of the 10 were dead. And that's the world that we lived in that time, and I couldn't figure out how to cope with it. So I heard about this new program that was starting to feed people with AIDS. And looking back now, I realized that Community Servings was my path to be able to cope with HIV. It was an organization that was trying to feed people because there were no medications. If you had AIDS in the early years, it was a death sentence, as you know. But what you don't know is that the majority of people in the early years of AIDS died of malnutrition, because they weren't consuming enough fuel to fight off the virus, their body was looking for some way to kill this thing, and it would burn all their lean body mass. And so in the early years, young men would lose all their muscle tissue and die of malnutrition before anything else, pneumocystis pneumonia or AIDS could kill them. So we figured out if you could feed people, you could keep them alive longer. And the mantra of food as medicine is where we were born and where we continue today, but we've gone from HIV to 35 different illnesses. So we realized, again, I was drawn to feed gay men with AIDS, but it didn't matter whether it was breast cancer, kidney failure, et cetera. And now we also do food service job training. We have a local foods program. We do a lot with nutrition education around helping people with illnesses. But it's all, to me, about food entrepreneurship. And the last thing I want to say is that years ago, I said, what if we started a bake sale and we could sell some pies to raise money for this early program that needed money, and I could get my friends in the restaurant business. Well, the first year we thought we'd sell 100 pies, we sold 1,000. 20 years later, we sell 15,000 pies for Thanksgiving. We raise over $500,000, and in the last 20 years, we've raised $6 million from a bake sale. So when you think about entrepreneurship, there's a tremendous opportunity. All it takes is your brains and your enthusiasm, and you can have a huge impact the way we have.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandy Brooks. I'm the Director of Community Programs at the Food Project here in Boston. And it's a 20-year-old nonprofit that does sustainable agriculture, youth leadership development, and community food access and food justice education. My background, however, is in architecture and planning and community design. So within the last year that I've been at the Food Project, I get asked, and much more than I thought I would, how exactly did you end up at this organization? And while it makes perfect sense to me in my head, I've found that I need to develop a way of telling people the story of how I came to work in food systems. And for me, there are three strands to it: faith, work, and health. And so I'm going to talk about those three things. The first really comes from faith and my faith background, and beginning to work with an organization here in Boston of Christians who were looking at how basically the biblical call to pursue justice in the world connected with modern life, and what did that mean for modern Christians, and how did you actually live that out? And one of the big things we started to look at actually was, particularly in the United States, was American consumerism, and how that played into justice issues globally and also domestically. And one of the areas that we started looking at was food, and actually looking at the Farm Bill and looking at the very interesting way that U.S. food policy affects everything that goes on around the world. And really the way that U.S. food policy and American consumerism was destroying the livelihoods of small farmers and people in many, many nations across the country, as well as small farmers in the United States. And so we began thinking as a group about, well, how do we, again, as Christians looking to try and live out our faith, start addressing this huge question of global poverty, which seems like an enormous thing that you can't even begin to touch, through at least some small area that we can control around our consumerism, looking at a variety of things, again, including food. And so that got me to thinking, how do I purchase justly, and what does that even mean? And is it organic, is it local, is it all of these different things, and really trying to understand how I could play that out in the way that I shopped. And a little bit after that, I also began to come to food from this other pathway, which was actually through my professional work. For 4 years, I ran a nonprofit called the Community Design Resource Center of Boston that linked up design professionals with community organizations to do pro bono projects and education programs around architecture and planning and other forms of design. And we did this Youth Community Design Summit, and we're always looking for ways to talk to youth about how design could be used as a tool for community change. And a friend of mine had come up with this great idea about using urban gardening as a way to transform the landscape of Roxbury and Dorchester, where there are hundreds of vacant lots as a result of a variety of land use and planning injustice that has gone on in Boston. And at first for me, this was a really great idea just in terms of land use and in terms of community engagement. And I thought, okay, this is going to be really great. And then as I started to think, well, gardening isn't just about pretty flowers and pretty things in the environment, but people are looking at producing food. it started to captivate me. This idea that you could return the production of food to the urban landscape, the idea that all of a sudden you could use food to bring people together socially, to provide economic development opportunities, as well as to restore the environment. It really started me on this path of realizing that food is a tremendously powerful lens into what goes on in our world, and that it resonates with people because everybody has to interact with it in some way. We all have to eat. And so that started me on this professional path of beginning to explore food and beginning kind of as an amateur enthusiast, start getting other people to say, hey, you've got to come and look at what's going on in urban food systems and meet all of these people at the Food Project, at Revision House, at Haley House, who were inspiring me to think about urban food and urban food systems in this totally different way. And then the third piece of this for me was really around my personal health. Because like too many African-American families, I've got the whole list of chronic diseases between my parents and my grandparents. So you want to talk about obesity, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, high cholesterol. We've got it all. It swirls around and just decides who to land on. And so really there's this sense sometimes as a young person in my family, it's not a question of, am I going to get diabetes? It's a question of when I'm going to get diabetes. And that can really put you in a position of feeling like a victim to your body and to your family history. And so as I was thinking about food in this professional sense, food in this justice sense, I started thinking about food in this personal sense. And what does this actually mean to me in terms of my health and my family's health? I had my Michael Pollan revolution, as one does, and you know, reading in defense of food and really looking at how do you return to actual food? Not food-like product, as he says. I love that phrase. And then again, what does that mean for me and for my family? You know, thinking about that, when diabetes lands on you, it landed on me about early 2011. And there's a whole bunch of interesting emotional and psychological things that you go through in that point. But I think one of the exciting things for me was really being able to say, this is not something that I have to be a victim to. And that through the way that I interact with food, I can change this, and I can help to change this for my family as well. And I think it's exciting to be able to, when I talk to people in the community, talk about my personal food story and how to interact with stories that are much like many of the people that we work with in the communities where we work.
Thank you, TL. I guess I'm batting cleanup. I'm JD Kemp, founder of two different food ventures here in Boston. One is the Crop Circle Kitchen. It's a business incubator in Jamaica Plain, supports between 30 and 40 startup food entrepreneurs and their enterprises, and it's a churning set of people that, you know, 2 or 3 come in, 2 or 3 leave on about a monthly basis. And the other adventure is called FoodEx. It's an infrastructure business in the food space, and basically started with the intention of solving and or providing an alternative food system. So we looked at basically what was out there and the development of a regional food system and said, what are the biggest barriers? What are the things that we can solve? And have tried to jump in to fix as many of those as we can and try not to bite off too much. And I think that, to me, is where my story comes together, because I don't remember whether I was an engineer first or a cook first. They both happened long before I can remember. Probably should have learned not to take apart the dishwasher before making dinner, but the two things were always a part of my life and something that I grew up with and knew very early that I would pursue them both in one way or another. But it never occurred to me until about 5 years ago that they could actually be the same thing. And they had always been very compartmentalized. I had gone to engineering school. I'm a systems engineer by training, and had worked for a series of tech ventures here in Boston and elsewhere, and mostly Defense Department work and other totally inglorious things. And it was all very fascinating for my brain, but then I'd shut it off and I'd go home, or I'd drive to a farm, or I'd go to a farm stand and go home and spend 2 or 3 hours at night cooking. Most nights. That probably sounds really weird, but it was always a way for me to unwind. It was just something I'd always engaged with, and it's always been a big part of my life. When I started looking at what I was cooking, we were cooking in our house, and where it came from and what was going on, started to realize that we were essentially sourcing for ourselves. We were driving to farms, we were going to farmers markets, we had this laundry list, 40, 50 sources of food in a given week, none of which were ideal. And I started to look around and realize that I was eating what I thought was great food, but no one else I knew was. Nobody had access to it. I had chefs who were friends who didn't have access to it, and started to realize that this was a bigger problem. And it wasn't just in my house and the way I was dealing with things, but that as the local food movement, as it were, started to get some traction 5 or 6 years ago, I started to look around and realize that everybody had the same problem. From the food service chefs right down to the home cooks, getting access to good food at reasonable prices in reasonable ways is a challenge. And the second thing I realized, see, engineer, entrepreneur, was that the people who determined who was buying from whom and at what price and what was going on and where food was going had absolutely no motivation to help out the growers and the people producing the food, nor the buyers and the chefs and the eaters on the other side. There was no reason that the existing distribution infrastructure and the food system as a whole could essentially heal itself, in my opinion, and move toward a more sustainable vision of how to organize itself as a system. So we jumped in to see what we could do about that. Some of that is Crop Circle Kitchen is providing a platform for new food startups to have a space to join this movement and be a part of what's going on. And part of it, the other side of that, is the much uglier, as it were, nuts and bolts business of food distribution. And we dumped into that to try to provide a different way for buyers and sellers to see each other across a marketplace and get connected that way. And I'm glad to say we found some threads that have brought some great meaning both to farmers and to the buyers, and are starting to show a story that says this is actually possible. It's totally possible for a chef at an institutional scale to purchase tens of thousands of pounds of produce and protein on a weekly basis at prices that match the commodities they used to buy from overseas and across the country and everything else. And it takes some business changes, it takes some creative thinking, it takes a lot of business model evolution. It's really what it is, but it's possible. And the thing that I realized through all of this is my sort of worlds collided and convalesced back into the same place, is that all of these threads come together when you look at the development of food and bringing food into the urban environment and solving some of these problems. There are environmental solutions, there are food security solutions, there are food safety solutions. Certainly when you talk about economic development and regional economic forces, all of these things come together in food. That's why we're all talking about it today. It's why it's become such a great topic. And I certainly encourage anyone out there who is thinking of becoming a food entrepreneur that we have a lot of problems to solve. There's no question about that. It's a very critical part of our evolution, literally, as humans, I think, to re-engage with our food supply and get back engaged with what's going on there. And I look forward to talking to all of you, and thanks for having us.
Can we applaud again, please? Those were amazing stories. So we're actually going to change a little bit the format. We just want to open it up if there are any general questions to any of our storytellers. At this point, please feel free. We have 2 microphones. Anyone?
I don't need a microphone. I've got a very loud voice.
Okay.
My question is to JD. I don't work in the food business. I happen to just love to eat. But one thing that really outrages me is both the food and the food education we give to our elementary students. How do we re-engineer that?
Great question, and there are a lot of threads behind it, and I think some folks on the panel may have some ideas as well. I'll take the piece that's closest to what we're doing, and that's the infrastructure part. There is, if you look at the economics of what a meal costs in an elementary school, certainly in a public school environment, and how that gets funded and where it comes from, and the USDA commodities program, and I could go on for a while about some of the major economic forces and how you are supposed to land a nutritious meal for $1.78, something like that per head, $1.10. There you go. There's your reimbursement. Some people get a kick from the department, et cetera. But nonetheless, when you look at that and you look around, McDonald's can't do that. So when you start to say, how do you do that with fresh vegetables? There are many things that need to be changed there. But I think, this gets to sort of share the wallet. What are we going to spend our money on? And that goes both to the educational piece and to the nutritional piece. I think, my discussion of how all these threads seem to come together, if you look at what happens if you provide better nutrition, there are actually some pretty good studies about this. school performance improves, all sorts of things, behavioral issues. There are a million things that happen if you look at nutrition as a source to start. So some of that is just trying to gather energy around that, get that word out, get people to engage with what's going on, appreciate that it's very difficult to eat fresh vegetables for $1 anything, and that's part of, why is it $1.78? Look at the subsidy programs, look at all the rest that's going on, get in the politics of it. But behind that, there are a lot of growers in Massachusetts and in this area that have direct relationships with schools and elementary schools and do provide fresh food. And so the hopeful solution there, there's a lot of noise about stuff that's wrong, but some of the hopeful solution is that if a grower can look at a school as at least 6 or 8 month buyer, somebody who can be an at volume, at scale buyer who can make a commitment, and that produce is going a short distance for a predetermined price, then the farmer says, this is my cost of production, here's my margin, there's my price. Nobody else is getting in the way of what's going on there, and you get a place where the growers and the eaters are happier. We see that happen. Anybody else want to answer?
It's an excellent question. It's really tied very much to public policy. The fact that in this country we can't even yet pass the Farm Bill in our current state of confusion. And, part of the food bank system, thinking I've been in it 32 years, you clearly have major industry, in the food business represented as all the way down to your local or through to your local farmer growing in a community. But connecting schools to communities is one of the most powerful things that can happen for the opportunity to understand where food comes from. I had a kid from Department of Youth Services. She believes spaghetti came from a can. Okay, we didn't get even to how to make sauce. We only got to how to boil water. But even teaching her how to do that was a significant improvement. And so, but most kids today don't have the same elementary understanding, which is why what was old is incredibly cool today. So it's just it's a novelty in some ways, and how do we make it back a norm? Pre-pesticides. Of course it does. 55 cents of every dollar spent on food in America is spent outside the home. Okay, so it's please.
However, horrible way to start a sentence. There is another aspect to this that I think is extremely positive, because everything that I've heard today so far to your question is very, very true. I'm 51 years old. 15 years ago, that question would have scared the crap out of me because there was no answer to it. I look at the stories that are being told up here, and I see that there are answers and solutions and people who are moving past that dangerous political discourse that ends up just separating us, where all we argue about are our differences. And we're starting to celebrate our commonalities. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through the mass entertainment industry, something that I'm very familiar with. 15 years ago, if you asked the couple of young people in this room under the age of 14 who's their favorite chef, they would absolutely have, my mom or dad, the guy at the pizza shop down the street. If they were lucky, they saw public exactly. Today, food is hot right now. People who do what I do are the new rock stars. And while I detest that notion as a parent on one hand, a left-wing Lindsay liberal Jewish parent from New York City, I might add, I love the fact that food and food issues are now a part of our daily conversation in my house, in my friend's house, in our neighborhood, in many, many homes. Has it gotten to everyone and where it should yet? No. Is it starting and going to get there? You bet it will. We have a situation right now, that I'm, privy to the things behind locked doors and, the gleaming towers that decide what you're gonna see on TV. For 15 years, people have been trying to sell food programs for young people, both in the public television space, the commercial television space, and the cable industry. It has been the one untouchable. Nobody could figure it out. In the next year or two, you're going to see a lot of programming that kids are going to be able to flip onto and see some stuff that's going to be really radical, and I think it is going to jumpstart this. I'm really buoyed up by the level of conversation that's going on around food these days. My son and I were watching the Fantastic Four last night on TV, and we hadn't DVR'd it, so we had to watch the commercials. And a commercial came on for Kentucky Fried Chicken dippers. Now, a Kentucky Fried Chicken dipper represents everything scary to me about food. It is a salt, sugar, fat bomb in a scooped out shape designed to hold corn oil stabilizers, salt and sugar in liquid form that they lay out in little plastic trays for you to dunk into. And at one point, these guys are at this party and they're like, wow, this is an awesome party, dippers. And my son laughs. And I said, what's so funny, Noah? He's 7.5. He looks at me and goes, that's not chicken. Now, my kid gets a lot of extra input and has a food life that is not ordinary. However, what that represents is the social movement that's happening in America. 25 years ago, parents didn't back out of their driveways without a lap belt on and have the kid go, Daddy, you don't have a seat belt. They didn't think smoking was uncool. My kid and his friends, they're just, smoking's not cool. You know, they hear it in school. My kid talks about there aren't 3 vegetables for dinner. I mean, that kind of thing. It's changing. It really is.
I just want to chime in a little bit. We, on a for-profit basis, feed 5 local schools. So we do feeding about 600 kids, about 1,000 meals a day. And the reason why kids in America are poorly fed is the same reason that our grandparents, our parents are poorly fed if they're getting Meals on Wheels, is that the reimbursement rates are stagnant and way too low. But having said that, we've found a way to make money at it, and the profit we generate feeds more people for free. But I think it starts with not just looking for frozen sandwiches shipped in from New Jersey, but local partnerships. We couldn't feed thousands and thousands of people, but we can do 600 to 1,000 kids really well. So more small vendors like us, I think, is viable. The second is, I think, on a larger scale, is that we have to teach people how to cook. I think there's a whole generation, and this is one of the things that drives me in the big picture, there's a whole generation that didn't learn to cook. They didn't stand next to their grandmother or stir the batter. And so when you say we're going to give you a subsidized CSA or we're going to bring you local produce, they're going to use it as a doorstop because they don't know what you do with an eggplant. And so I think the more that we're driving people back into the kitchen and understanding that you can prepare something delicious, simple, cheap, and fast, as well or better than McDonald's.
One of the things I just wanted to mention is that there's a tremendous amount that's going on in terms of the school food movement, in terms of whether it's a direct farm to school movement or just improving school food and improving the quality and health of it. It involves everything from finding people who are willing to work on the delivery and sourcing to working with existing sourcing companies like Sodexo or Whitson's and talking about the changes that they want to make, to training food service workers, to improving cafeteria facilities in schools. And the impetus for a lot of this is coming from parents and coming from students. So in direct response to your question, what do we do about that? A lot of that power lies within community members to agitate for something better. And again, both adult and youth community members have gotten tremendously involved in insisting that the food that they eat in schools should be healthy and should be positive and beneficial for them. One of the things I also want to know, it's often easy to concentrate this as a minority problem, as a poor people problem, as a young people problem. And I want to know this is an American problem. It crosses age lines, it crosses race lines, it crosses income lines. I grew up in suburban Northern Virginia. It's a nice upper middle class community, one of the wealthiest school systems in the country. I ate everything else that my peers ate. It's a universal problem. It just happens to concentrate its effects among folks who have the least power to counteract those. So I really want to make sure in our conversation we keep that in mind.
And that's like a baby step where, and you can have them in the urban garden
not just kids either. It's everyone who's underserved in America. I'm on the board of a group in New York called Services for the Underserved. It's a massive organization. We have over 12,000 veterans in assisted living programs in the 5 boroughs. And in all of those residential communities that we've created, we now have community gardens. Not only are we now, I think we're averaging 12,000 pounds of fruit and vegetables a season. That's a massive amount of food for those groups. But what we're finding is that it's not just the cost savings for the building. It's the jobs that are generated from it, the pride, the health and wellness level, not only of consuming fresh food, but of tending it and creating it for itself. And it's jump-started an entrepreneurial project for us. One of our big problems is job training for our veterans and those that have mental health issues that provide them from having a lot of mainline jobs. We're able to do job training through the gardens that are in our residences, and we've bought Zoop franchises and are putting them. First one is in Grand Central Station, and they're actually going to work selling their own product and creating recipes based on what they've tested that has come from their very own gardens. If you saw the joy and the hope that has created, not only is it a financial success, a health wellness success, a social model success, but I think what's staggering there is that as someone who was underserved at one point in his life and certainly ready to slip off the face of the earth past the safety net, you sprinkle a little love and hope and respect and dignity on some of these communities, the same way you sprinkle some of this love and hope and respect about food on young people, and you'd be amazed at what happens. The recovery rate is it's staggering, staggering.
And it's also worth mentioning that a number of schools are using those gardens for food production and also as an opportunity for education. Something that we do at the Food Project, build gardens at schools and community centers, conduct educational programming, in the sciences and math, and really tying that into curriculum. There's a national AmeriCorps-funded program called FoodCorps, which is deploying hundreds of young people across the United States to be able to work in gardening, in nutrition education, and in improving school food. So again, there's really a lot going on in this area that's tremendously positive.
I guess my question is sort of on the lines of the previous question about food services in schools, specifically related to colleges. So Sodexo is our provider, both at Olin and Babson, and it just seems like it's such a it's a bureaucracy, and it's a for-profit company. So like their bottom line is dependent on selling a lot of meals and getting a lot of cheap food. So it's low cost to them, and they can make a huge profit on selling it to us. And it seems like that's at conflict with this idea of providing healthy meals and like good quality food, because if like they source it locally, it's more expensive, and if they like cook with better ingredients, it like decreases their bottom line. How do you get over that without going into food policy? And like you were saying something like, like we're at the point where we can like put that behind us and talk about like how food just brings us all together. But like in my mind, it always comes back to like the farm bill and how we're subsidizing like big corn industry, and like that is why that line exists. Like I just
Yeah, I mean, I think you are right in that you can't stay in that bubble for long and not eventually have to talk about food policy. And there are, again, a number of things that college and university students are doing on their campuses to change their food system. If any of you aren't familiar with the Real Food Challenge, again, national organization based here in Boston that's doing exactly this, helping students to figure out how they organize to work with their university administration and with their food service providers, insisting that, again, they want real, healthy, sustainable, just food in their schools. And one of the advantages, not everything we do in life is as a consumer. In this case, one of the advantages, universities and ultimately Sodexo have to respond to their consumers, their constituents. And so students have been able to exercise a tremendous amount of power, indicating to their administrations that this is something that is of critical importance to them, and using a variety of organizing tools to do that. And then again, ultimately talking about Sodexo or Marriott or any of these other corporations, it might be more expensive for them to source locally. It's even more expensive for them to lose your business entirely.
Ding, 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 ding.
And that is a point of leverage. And sometimes it means you do shift providers and you find different providers. Other times it means you negotiate with your existing provider to get them to respond to your needs. But it is possible, and there are folks that you can link with who are taking an active role in showing how to do that, and who have shifted, at this point, hundreds of millions of dollars into local food sourcing at colleges.
They wouldn't just be hearing it from Babson.
Right, they're hearing from all over. Yeah.
There's tremendous pressure on them too.
I would agree. Consumers drove the taste changes in food. The consumer is driving organics. The consumer is asking for, whole grain cereal. General Mills didn't wake up one day and go, oh, I think we'll change our grain to whole grains. It was consumer pressure to change. And then they do. And so it's a very important part of cause and affecting change in terms of standing up, because the models are proving that you can begin to make money. You can begin to eat well, take care of your community, think about the environment, and avoid chronic diseases at a cost that's reasonable in our communities. The price is just far too high, because we don't have a healthcare system, we have a sick care system. And what's also transitioning is we're thinking about well-being, which is health, versus chronic diseases. Great question.
I wanted to just comment on it from a historical point of view. There's two food movements that I think about in history that are relevant when you talk about changing food systems, even at a local level like a college. First one I'll give you is the free produce movement that happened before the end of slavery. And that what many people did who were against slavery was to create this boycott to not to purchase any food that was produced by farm labor, enslaved labor. For example, rice in South Carolina and places like that. So that was a very important movement that put a dent into the end of slavery. The other one I think about is something much more contemporary, and that is Martin Luther King's lieutenant, Ralph Abernathy. Abernathy served in World War II. Decorated soldier, sergeant, and went to school, Alabama State, on the GI Bill. And one of the first things he did when he got into school was he was elected class president, and he moved quickly to change the cafeteria menu. The students at Alabama State were receiving inadequate, very different food from what the faculty was doing, and he organized an actual boycott against that. Now, as I say to students when we talk about social movements, there's many different levels. You don't have to go straight to a boycott, but one of the things that you know is that you can either get mad or you can get organized. If you get organized, people have to listen to you. Just as he was saying, Sodexo would want to know what the consumer wants, and if you get organized, you have a much better way of articulating what you want, and they know that you have a group of people behind you who stand on what you're saying. This is what the students here at Babson or any other university want. So getting organized and think about what have people done in the past to actually change their food. There are a lot of examples in history.
JD, yes, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that I've been struck by as a listener, a participant here like you, was something that you said that you sort of flew right by, which was that you now have provable economic models that back up decentralizing our food production system. I'm paraphrasing. So, as someone, again, an older person, the historically, our problem has been centralizing our food system in this country. For 70 years, we thought that was the thing that would be of the most use to us. We now see that we've gone too far. It's got a lot of danger, health, wellness, overproduction, feedlot animals, blah, 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 blah. From your perspective, and I love the question because we are in a transition phase right now. We have one foot in this future that we can all see and touch and see some successes, and it's palpable, and then we kind of look down into today and we see some problems. So it's a very difficult position for all of us in this room to be in, because we've neither cured the problem nor gotten far enough to think that for sure we're going to get there. But I know that for 15 years, the last 15, I've sat in rooms arguing about these things, and ultimately at some point, the smartest person in the room gets up and says, when somebody proves that you can make money at it again by decentralizing it, guess what? You match that up with that I want it-itis, and it starts to happen, because there are entrepreneurs, there are people out there who are going to provide that thing that we want, the way we want it, that provides us with a clean conscience when it comes to our social justice needs, and it becomes the lucre of the day. And I think that's really, really important.
So we're just going to shift up the format a little bit. We're going to invite our wonderful, amazing speakers and storytellers to each sit at one of the tables. We'll do some round robining and kick off some conversation, sort of more digging into some of these issues and pieces of your stories that you shared. So you're very welcome to sit at whichever table you like.